Well, hello all. My name is Luca Frumento, and I have the great privilege of introducing Mr. William W. Galloway. Mr. Galloway is a senior studying political science and military leadership here at Clemson. He is a Lyceum Scholar who has dedicated himself to the serious study of Plato. He is the South Carolina State Director of the American Conservation Coalition, an organization dedicated to building the conservative environmental movement. His passion for the environment is rooted in love of the land, as he hiked, fished, and farmed land in Hartsville, land belonging to his family, for 188 years and counting. He is the former chair of the South Carolina College Republicans and former leader in the Clemson undergraduate student government. Mr. Galloway is a soldier, as he will go on to serve the 263rd Army Air Missile Defense Command in the South Carolina National Guard following his time here at Clemson. Mr. Galloway's other interests include bourbon, Diet Coke, guitar, golf, Walker Percy, or some combination of these things. I had the great honor of meeting Mr. Galloway our freshman year. A true testament to his generosity and to his personality. Upon discovering I had not yet tried cheer wine, he took me up to his mini fridge, which was exclusively stocked with cheer wine and Diet Coke. We cracked one open, and the rest is history. I guess virtue is teachable. I'm lucky to count Will among my closest friends. Student, philosopher, politician, soldier, and finally now, at his peak, an LSSS speaker. Most importantly, he is one of the kindest and most genuine people to walk this earth. Without further ado, I present the glorious William W. Galloway.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Luca, for your very kind introduction. You flatter me. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Thompson, without whom none of us would be here, the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, all our faculty, past and present, and especially Dr. J. Michael Hoffpower, who has been my thesis advisor, without whose support and guidance I wouldn't be here today. So we're here today to talk about virtue, specifically virtue in Plato's Meno. The Meno is unique among all of the Platonic dialogues in that it is the only one that specifically raises the question, what is virtue? The dialogue begins with Meno asking Socrates whether virtue is something teachable or not. Socrates responds that he cannot begin to answer Meno's questions until he grasps what in the world virtue is. He and Meno embark on an inquiry into the nature of virtue, and eventually they begin to investigate who might the teachers of virtue be. Shortly thereafter, Anytus, who is hosting Meno in Athens, sits down beside them, and this is our point of departure today. Socrates tells Anytus that his arrival is most fortuitous. Anytus is a prominent democratic politician in Athens. His father was the wealthy and wise Enthymon, a sort of self-made man, and the consummate Athenian gentleman. If there is such a thing as a teacher of virtue, then Enthymon must have been just such a teacher. And perhaps he was. The people of Athens kept re-electing his son after all. Socrates lays this out on the table, but he doesn't immediately ask about the teachers of virtue. Instead, he asks Anytus to tell him who he might send Meno to if Meno wanted to become a good physician or a good shoemaker. It's important to note here that Socrates isn't asking a hypothetical question. He's asking about Meno, who is sitting in front of them, conversing with them. The stakes here are real, and they are high. Anytus agrees with Socrates that in these cases, and in the case also of learning a musical instrument, they would send Meno to A, those who claim to know the art, and B, those who take money to teach it. But alas, Meno does not want to be a doctor or a cobbler or an aloes player. He's politically ambitious, and he wants wisdom and virtue. So who then are Socrates and Anytus to send Meno to? Well, there are two premises in Socrates' question here. First is that virtue is teachable, and second is that virtue is political. Well, based on the criteria that they've just laid out, it seems like Meno should go to the sophists. Anytus does not like this idea at all. "Hush, Heracles," Socrates, he says, and Anytus hopes that none of his friends or family, whether they be local or foreigner, fall victim to this kind of madness because the sophists apparently ruin and corrupt everyone who so much as associates with them. Now, this is a strange statement for Anytus to make in the presence of his guest friend. Meno, after all, is a student of the famous sophist Gorgias. Surely Anytus knows this. Does he think that Meno is mad, corrupted, ruined? If so, why would he host such a man? Does he perhaps think that he, Anytus, could be a teacher of virtue and might be able to save Meno? Socrates expresses great surprise at Anytus' outburst. He says that shoe and cloak menders who always return shoes or cloaks in a worse condition would be stoned to death. According to Anytus, however, the sophists, take for instance Protagoras, always return their students in worse condition than they were found and remain practicing their business in collecting fees. In Protagoras' case, he does so for 40 years. Socrates asks how the sophists could continue to have clients. How are they unique in the world of business that they can continually charge a fee for making things worse? Socrates offers up two possible answers for Anytus. The first is that the sophist's art is so dangerous because it corrupts those who are too young to know better. As long as there are young people, the sophist will always have clients. It is again strange that Anytus would say this in the presence of his young guest friend Meno, who is about 19 or 20 years old at this time. In this case, the sophists are not driven out of business or stoned to death because those who should be driving them out of business or stoning them are the very ones they have already corrupted. The second possibility is that the sophists themselves are mad. This also seems improbable, as it is unlikely that a madman could continually attract clients year after year. Anytus reports that it is not the sophists who are mad. No, it is the young people who go to them who are mad. Even worse are the relatives who permit these young people to go to them. But the maddest of all, says Anytus the politician, are the cities that allow the sophists to enter and do not kick them out. The city is concerned with virtue, and the sophists, at least in Anytus' mind, pose a threat to the city and to virtue. There are three claims of concern for virtue, or at least claims to teach virtue, present here. First, there is the political concern for virtue, the concern of the city and of the many, represented here by Anytus. Second, there is the philosophic concern for virtue, which is represented by Socrates and which has dominated the dialogue, at least up until Anytus' entry. Third, there is the sophists' claim to teach virtue, represented by Gorgias' student Meno. Anytus' declaration that the city should ban sophistry lest it corrupt and ruin the young indicates that the political concern for virtue might be threatened by the sophists' teaching. Socrates asks Anytus how he knows that the sophists are so dangerous. Has one ever done him any injustice? Anytus declares that neither he nor any of his own have ever had anything to do with the sophists. For this to be true, though, despite being a guest of Anytus, Meno must not be one of his own friends. If Anytus really had no experience with the sophists, then perhaps it was divine revelation that was the source of Anytus' knowledge. Socrates presses on and asks who in Athens Meno should go to if he wants to learn virtue. By now, Anytus is getting angry. "Why don't you tell them?" he snaps back at Socrates. Socrates responds that he did. He suggested that Meno go see the sophists, but Anytus didn't like that suggestion. Socrates even allows that Anytus' critique might well have some merit, and again poses that question to Anytus. The well-being of Meno's own soul now seems to be at stake here. He has confirmed that he does indeed wish to learn virtue, even if it is only to fulfill his political ambitions. It seems now at least possible that his old teacher Gorgias has corrupted his soul. The need for an answer to Meno's query now has an added urgency. Anytus retorts angrily that Socrates should tell Meno where he should go to find a teacher, to which Socrates that he has already spoken about those things already, but apparently unsatisfactorily. He tells Anytus to offer a name, any name, of someone in Athens to whom Meno might go. The increasingly agitated Anytus refuses to offer any one name. Instead, he offers up the entire class of Athenian gentlemen. He says that these could offer a better example to Meno than any sophist, given the condition that Meno be willing to obey them. Anytus advises Meno that to take as a teacher of virtue the members of the political community itself. Socrates is incredulous. He asks if the gentlemen became good spontaneously and if they are somehow able to teach the things which they themselves were never taught. The question now seems to be whether virtue is present in some way by nature, or if it is formed in the community in the absence of a formal teacher. Anytus suggests that the predecessors are the source of education in virtue for the gentlemen. Their fathers taught them, and they will teach their sons. The noble and good men perpetuate the received opinions of the noble and good, teaching their sons and preserving the political regime. Anytus then challenges Socrates. Does Socrates doubt that there are many good men in the city? Anytus understands the city not only to be the arena for virtue, but the source and defender of virtue. As such, he cannot tolerate any threat to the city, for any threat to that which is held to be good is necessarily bad or evil. Sophistry represents a threat to Anytus and to the city, as it undermines the moral opinions upon which the city and Anytus's position in it rest. Socrates raises the obvious problem that good men do not always have good sons. He challenges Anytus to examine whether the good men in Athens, past and present, knew how to bestow on another the virtue which they themselves were great. He does not ask Anytus whether they actually taught virtue, but whether they knew how to do so. He seems to assume that if the Athenian gentlemen knew how to teach virtue, then they would have. Socrates could easily have used Anytus and his father to make this argument, but Socrates does not insult his already incensed interlocutor in this way. Instead, he offers up the example of Themistocles, whom Anytus considers the greatest of men. Socrates asks whether Themistocles could have been a good teacher of his own great virtue. His reasoning seems to be that if it's possible for anyone to teach virtue, then it must be possible for the most virtuous man to do so. If Themistocles can't teach virtue, maybe no one can. Anytus seems to anticipate where Socrates' line of questioning is going. He asserts that surely Themistocles could, but adds the caveat, if he wanted to. Well, why would Themistocles not want to teach his son virtue? Socrates offers up two possible answers as to why Themistocles might not have wanted his son, Cleophantus, to be virtuous. The first is that somehow Themistocles bore ill will against Cleophantus and therefore did not teach him virtue in the respect to which Themistocles himself was good. But Themistocles taught Cleophantus to ride a horse and to do so quite well. If he taught his son this art, then he probably didn't have ill will against him. The second possibility seems more troubling, as it is rooted in the life of Themistocles himself. Now, Themistocles was a prominent military and political leader in Athens. He was considered a strategic genius who pioneered the Greek naval superiority to Persia, and yet he was exiled and sentenced to death in absentia. Nobody has claimed that Cleophantus was good and wise in the respect to the virtues in which his father was, and Socrates asks Anytus if they suppose that Themistocles did not want to make Cleophantus any better than his neighbors. The second, more troubling possibility is that perhaps because of Themistocles' own perils at the hands of his neighbors, he recognized the danger posed by virtue and wanted to spare his son the same fate. By leading a life of extreme virtue, Themistocles put a target on his back. By declining to teach his son virtue, Themistocles was protecting Cleophantus. Until now, most of the discussion of the political philosophical problem has been centered around the problem that philosophy poses to the city, but there have been hints of the danger that politics poses to the philosopher, most significantly earlier in the dialogue when Meno issued a thin threat to Socrates. Now, though, this danger has come to the foreground. The threat to Cleophantus would come from his neighbors. They despise men of outstanding virtue. Men like Themistocles, when it sets someone on higher ground than them. Their hatred poses a threat to any person of virtue and a threat to anyone who questions the virtue of the many. Anytus' response indicates that he senses the problem, perhaps in no small part because as an elected representative of the many, he will shortly pose just such a threat to Socrates. Lest Anytus think that Themistocles and Cleophantus are isolated examples, Socrates offers some more. He poses the case of Aristides and Lysimachus. Aristides, like Themistocles, was a great man, but Lysimachus was a bit of a scoundrel. Socrates tells us that Anytus surely would have had first-hand account of this. He was friends with Lysimachus. Anytus fails to respond, probably because he doesn't want to risk offending his friend and his neighbor. As we all know, elected politicians never want to insult their voters or their friends. Socrates then offers up Pericles and his sons Paralus and Xanthippus as examples. Like Themistocles, Pericles trained his sons to be great horsemen. He trained them in music and in gymnastics, but he did not or could not train them to be virtuous. Perhaps he too understood the danger of virtue in democratic Athens. In the final estimation, he tells Anytus that perhaps virtue is not teachable after all. Anytus does not respond substantively to Socrates' claims, nor does he defend the character of his fellow Athenians. Instead, he threatens Socrates. He tells Socrates that he speaks ill of people too lightly and that he needs to be careful because in Athens it is very easy indeed to benefit people or to harm them. Anytus seems to sense that Socrates has intentionally provoked him, and he doubts that Socrates will take his warning. And so instead he intimates that if Socrates does not recant his slander of the Athenian gentleman, Anytus and the city would be ready and willing to use force against him. This will be the last time that Plato's readers hear anything from Anytus until he appears in the Apology, when he will join Meletus and Lycon on putting Socrates on trial for corrupting the youth, the same charge that Anytus has leveled against the Socrates. It's also worth noting that in the trial, Anytus accuses Socrates on behalf of the politicians. Socrates does not defend himself from Anytus' attack. He only says that he is not surprised that Anytus is angry. He says Anytus supposes that he is slandering these gentlemen, and it seems that perhaps Socrates is slandering them, or is pitying them, not slandering them. The father's filial love prevents him from raising his sons up in virtue and excellence for fear of putting them in danger at the fickle and spiteful hands of the many. The sons can only be pitied because they have never had the opportunity to learn virtue. As Anytus' anger and Themistocles' exile show, the jealousy and rage of the many can arise quickly and viciously. Second, Socrates supposes that because of Anytus' failure to raise a good son, he sees himself in the category that Socrates is slandering. It seems unlikely that Socrates would place Anytus into this category. It is an ironic comment. Earlier in this section, Socrates indicates that he holds Anytus in far lower esteem than Themistocles or Pericles or even Anytus' father Enthymon. While they chose not to teach their sons virtue because doing so would pose a danger to them, Anytus raised a drunkard son because he himself is not a man of virtue or excellence, and so he could not teach another to be a man of virtue or excellence. Socrates seems entirely unfazed by the danger in which he has placed himself. Perhaps he has provoked this conflict as a warning to Meno. If Meno listens to Socrates and continues to engage in philosophical inquiry into the nature of virtue, he needs to be fully prepared to accept the consequences. Socrates' exchange with Anytus brings philosophy and politics into the open. It shows that the political concern for virtue can accommodate neither the sophist's claim to teach it nor the philosopher's inquiry into the nature of virtue. When Anytus appears as an interlocutor, the stakes of the dialogue raise immediately. Their discussion of sophistry and its insufficiency of those who are most commonly considered teachers of virtue, and it becomes apparent that the well-being of Meno's own soul is at issue. When Anytus offers up the collective Athenian gentlemen as teachers of virtue, Socrates offers several examples of well-regarded fathers who did not or could not raise virtuous sons. This exchange not only casts doubt on the teachability of virtue, but shows the danger that virtue poses in the city, and our section here ends with an explosive threat from Anytus to Socrates, which will be borne out soon enough. And with that, I'll take your questions. Unless I've answered everything already. Father Noah.
Can virtue be taught?
There's never really a satisfying answer in the dialogue. But the last line of the dialogue says that Socrates tells Meno that he should continue this conversation and he should try and teach the things that Socrates has taught Meno to Anytus. Meno should become the teacher of Anytus. And so, even though there's never really a formal, official, satisfying answer that Plato gives us here, it seems like if there wasn't at least some way that virtue could be taught, the dialogue wouldn't close that way. So, my guess is that at least to a certain extent it can be. Yeah, Mrs. Alpar.
Yeah, can you, I know you touched on it, but I want to hear more. Can you flesh out a little more the relationship between the Athenian gentleman and the many, especially as it relates to anger?
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems as though the concern for virtue among the many is at bottom the same concern for virtue that the Athenian gentlemen have, and that the Athenian gentlemen are somehow a model for the many of virtue and the political conception of virtue that's at work here. It certainly seems like the anger of the many is much easier to rile up than the anger of the Athenian gentlemen. But as we know from the case of Themistocles, and we know from the case of Socrates, when the gentleman's anger gets riled up, the consequences can be deadly. So, to me it seems like, in a lot of ways, even if they're not part of the same class, they're representative of the same sort of conception of virtue. And so, the main difference seems to be that the gentleman might clean up a little bit better, if that answers it all. Luca.
To Socrates, is virtue always disconnected from the political community? Does it necessarily have to be unconcerned with it, and to what extent would it be concerned with the political community if it necessarily was?
I don't think that it is disconnected at all. Maybe in some way, but I don't think in the final estimation it is. And the reason that I'm thinking that is the dialogue opens. Meno asks Socrates, can you tell me whether virtue is something teachable or whether it comes to be present some other way? And Socrates doesn't answer that. He goes on this weird little tangent about Thessaly and Athens, two cities, and he talks about the character of those cities, the political character of those two cities, and a change that's been brought about by sophistry and philosophy in those two cities. Sophistry in Thessaly by Gorgias, and perhaps ironically, a change in the character of Athens by a nameless someone who we can infer is Socrates. So the inquiry into virtue begins with politics. Meno's first definition is very political. Socrates doesn't find this definition satisfying, but at the end of the dialogue, in the answer that I was giving to Father Noah, we find that when Socrates tells Meno to teach Anytus the things that Meno had learned that day, he says there'll be a certain benefit that can be rendered to the city. And so the dialogue that raises the question, what is virtue, begins and ends with politics. So it's from that, I wouldn't say that concerns of virtue can ever really be divorced from concerns of politics. Mom.
Okay. I am not tracking on some of this, but is virtue subjective to one or the other? So when you're saying Socrates, his definition of virtue versus the other, how do they duke it out, decide where's the right?
Well, it's kind of tough. They almost come to blows at least twice in the dialogue. But
So do you defend one more than the other?
well, so right at the beginning, when Socrates turns the question back on Meno and says, well, what do you say virtue is? Meno says, well, there's a virtue of a man, there's a virtue of a woman, there's a virtue of a ruler, there's a virtue of a child, there's a virtue of a slave, there's all these different kinds of virtues. And Socrates says, no, I'm not asking what the virtue of a man is, I'm asking what virtue is. And it has to be the thing that holds true in all of these different things. He starts talking about shapes and colors at a particular point. He's not asking what blue is or what green is. He's asking what color is. So, yeah, certainly virtue looks different at different times, but virtue as such has to be something that holds true across different cases and across different times, different cities, different people. We know it has to hold true for different ages. Socrates and Anytus and Meno are all at least a little bit different in age. Two of them are from Athens, one of them's a foreigner. They're in different stages of life. One of them's a guest, one of them owns the home, one of them is there for some reason talking about virtue. So we know that in those cases, virtue has to be objective, at least as much as we can talk about what virtue is. Yeah.
So could you give an example of some of the objective virtues that would hold true to the entire citizenry?
Not from this dialogue.
Okay.
I don't think so. My guess would be that it would... I don't like turning to another thinker to answer your question, but in my mind, when I start thinking about virtue, my mind goes to Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics. I don't, at least not here, Plato doesn't give an account of virtue always and everywhere is making your bed and brushing your teeth and telling your mother you love her before you leave. So there's no blueprint in that respect. This dialogue to me is more modeling what sort of inquiry you have to participate in to get to that question, rather than saying virtue is, courage, liberality, magnanimity, magnificence, all that kind of stuff. Dr. Daniels.
So late in the dialogue, right before the thing about, go off and teach Anytus about what we've learned, Socrates advances this distinction between true belief and knowledge, right? When they're struggling with this argument about is virtuous pieces of knowledge. If so, it should be able to be taught. And it's where he drops into the line about the virtuous politicians that he's mentioned, these characters, that they have that they're like the guide to the city. Where they talk about, you can tell someone how to get there even if you're not really sure about it.
Yeah.
If you have true belief. And so what then, how do you sort of fit that in the relationship of, are those leaders that he's calling out, that Anytus wants to be the representation of the virtue, are they authentic? Or maybe they just have this true belief. Maybe they just, true opinions, I think maybe sometimes that's translated with it. That they don't have virtue, but at least they know how to do the right things.
Right. I think that's where we get into this weird myth of the statues, and we have to tie down the statues or they're going to run away, and it's a weird section. It seems like these sort of people, the Themistocles, the Pericles, maybe virtue did arise spontaneously for them. Maybe they just are so greatly souled that they, even in the absence of a formal teacher, can model what virtue is for us. And the city has to sort of tie them down to say, okay, you go act like that. Which is really weird if that's, I'm not sure that's what Socrates is saying there, but if that is what he's saying, then that's really important to think about, because that's not what they did to Themistocles. Instead of tying him down, they kicked him out. Right. So maybe the concern for virtue that's at work in the city isn't quite as conscious as it needs to be. So. Dr. Thomas.
Yeah, I want to ask a little bit about Will Galloway.
Uh-oh.
Which is, what concerns of your own took you to the Meno in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
I have a sense of that because I know that you're in politics, obviously, and philosophy and virtue. But more particularly, I guess, maybe what made you choose the Meno? You mentioned the ethics earlier,
Mm-hmm.
as what we first think of for certain things. What about the Meno? And secondly,
Yeah.
How has the argument of the Meno thinking about it helped you think about what you're going to be doing in the future?
So for the first part of that, I'm going to say why these questions, why Plato, why the Meno. When I first had the idea, I want to write a thesis. I wanted to talk about, is virtue teachable? Because there's some pretty profound political implications there, right? If virtue is teachable, then shouldn't our laws incline us, push us toward virtue? Well, in talking to Dr. Hofbauer about that, I sort of realized, okay, well, I can't even begin to answer, like Socrates, I can't begin to answer that question until I understand in some way what virtue is. And I had initially said, well, why don't we read the Protagoras? Let's work on that, which is in the same little blue book that right here. But as I started thinking through what, at rock bottom I was interested in, the Meno seemed to be a much better fit than the Protagoras was. Plato, because there's plenty of other people who broach the question, what is virtue? I talked about Aristotle, and Aristotle's nice because you've got this is an oversimplification, but it's there's a little handy roadmap of here's virtue. But this is a lot more how philosophy happens, how life happens. If I go and talk to Luca one night and say, well, let's talk about what virtue is, it's not going to be Luca giving me a lecture on, do X, Y, and Z. It's going to be some back and forth. I'm going to disagree with him at times. I'm going to push back. He's going to push back on me. And I also like the presence of different interlocutors. There's a lot of times, I think there's a tendency to not take the interlocutors seriously in their own right and to just say, well, whatever Plato Socrates says is the real bread and butter here. But there's a lot of times in reading this that I found myself really sympathetic to Meno. And I was like, just give me an answer already. Which is what made this really fun. By the end of it, it's you feel kind of like you're at the conversation table with Meno and Anytus and Socrates. As far as where do I go from here? I have to take up the challenge that Socrates gives Meno at the end, right? I'm basically Meno's age. And Luca talked about, I've been involved in politics. I'm at least going to be involved in policy going forward. So in some ways, I am kind of near the Meno mold of things. So I have to continue this conversation. Socrates has taught me how to be interested in an inquiry to participate in an inquiry into virtue, now it's my job to keep doing that. I don't just get to say, all right, I've read the Meno, and now I get to go watch the Masters next weekend or whatever. I've got to keep going back to it. For me, that's the challenge at the end there is where I would think to go. Dr. Pierce.
So, well, the mystery of what is virtue is give me an answer already kind of thing. Is kind of the odd thing about the whole. So then we don't sort of complicate things when we look at talk about a virtue of a horse. We sort of look at the horse is strong, it's good, it's got a long mane, it runs, it's fast. And you say, yeah, that looks like a good horse. That's definitely
Right.
a strong, powerful, healthy horse in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't you sort of do that with human beings?
I think there's two sections in the dialogue that get at that. The first is Meno, his first answer is about, well, I want to tell you the virtue of a man, and I want to tell you the virtue of a woman, and a child, and a slave, and all these different things. And I think that's indicative of, it's, if I'm going to buy a horse, it's easy for me to look and say, that's the one I want because that looks like a good horse. It's a lot harder for me to look at Themistocles and say, I want to model myself after you, but, I'm not in the Athenian navy, I'm not rich, I'm not, maybe even a man. How am I going to model myself after you? How does that work for every other Athenian? And our tendency is to not always look at ourselves and say, what is the virtue of human being as such? We often want to look at ourselves and say, well, what's the virtuous man? What's the virtuous woman? What's the virtuous child? And to put ourselves in those categories and not think about virtue as such. The other thing I think that might get at that is what I was mentioning in Dr. Daniels' answer. My answer to Dr. Daniels, which is when I'm looking at the good horse, he's already on the lot to be sold to me, or he's in a pasture, or I'm riding the horse. If we banish the people like Themistocles that we ought to be looking at, then maybe it's a lot harder to get up close and personal and model ourselves after the truly excellent men. I don't know if that answers it, but that's at least how I'd start to think about it.
Yeah, or sort of the problem with human models, the metaphor, you got to kick the tires if you're buying a car, or the engine might fall
Mm-hmm.
out. You look at a horse and you can see whether it's lame or jumping over the fence, but is it that somehow with the human models you might buy a bill of goods, and there's always a risk of buying a bill of goods
Mm-hmm.
with modeling yourself on a hero. Is that the danger or something?
Yeah, and that's why they say not to build statues of people that are still alive. Don't meet your heroes, they're going to disappoint you. It's, maybe that's the benefit of reading something like Plutarch versus looking around at, the people around me that might be the paragons of virtue, because then we're going to find their old tweets from 2013 and cancel them. Instead, we've got to go read Plutarch and talk about real human greatness in that way rather than our contemporaries. So maybe that's also, maybe reading Plutarch or something like that is the way to kick the tires before you buy it here. Dad?
So when Plato's addressing the whole question of whether virtue can be taught, does he ever look at the possibility that maybe the answer is more in the student than what's being taught? For example, you got 3 generations of Galloway sitting here
Mhm.
Two of the three are good students, one's not. We all have very similar backgrounds.
Don't talk about me that way.
I would only talk about me now.
No, I definitely think that he takes very seriously the idea that certain people are going to be more inclined to virtue than others. It's been a while since I've read The Republic, but I know in The Republic we've got different sorts of human beings that might be inclined to different roles in the city or something like that. So he takes very seriously the differences in the soul and the character of human beings. And I think even part of it, the way that he's able to have this conversation with Meno is Meno comes to him and asks him. Meno might not be a particularly willing interlocutor in certain ways. There's some evidence that he's starting this whole conversation as a way to trick Socrates into saying something embarrassing and being able to go report that back to Thessaly. But he's at least somewhat interested in the question of virtue. If Anytus, or if Meno would rather be, down flirting with all the eligible young women of Athens, then maybe Socrates wouldn't be able to have this sort of conversation with him. So it definitely seems like there's certain sorts of people that are more open to the cultivation of virtue.
So you're saying that's why I wasn't a good student?
Well, you spent too much of your time at the SO Club. But. Yes, sir.
Do you think modern liberal politics would assuage Anytus's anger?
So I've been thinking a lot about this lately, and when we think about if the Socrates type existed in a modern liberal democracy that has freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom to tweet whatever I want and to, freedom of religion, on the face of it, it would seem like, well, Socrates can say whatever he wants, and Anytus is, if he doesn't like it, he doesn't have to follow him on Twitter. But I think there's sort of two ways that liberal democracy can treat that sort of challenge. The first is to kind of treat them like an eccentric, as a renegade, and to just ignore them. The other would be sort of deplatforming or canceling, if we want to use that term, them. It seems like in a liberal democracy, Socrates wouldn't be killed or put to death. But the anger that Anytus sees, the anger of the many and his neighbors, is still present in the liberal democracy. Liberal democracy doesn't change that because that seems to be part of human nature. But it does change the outlet for it. It's probably not, let's go put this guy on trial because we think he's corrupting the youth. It's, let's make sure that he's a pariah publicly. Does that make sense?
Could you say a little bit more to us about why you think this anger is a part of human nature, or politics always?
Yeah. I think this is one of the perpetual problems with democracies that lawgivers have to deal with. And you can look at this in the Federalist Papers, or you can look at problems with ancient Athenian democracy, is that the people get riled up really quickly. And we all have particular attachments that anytime those are threatened, we're going to react with anger. And in Dr. Bartlett's talk the other week, and in your class reading the rhetoric, we talked a lot about the difference in hatred and anger. And anger can be satisfied with punishment. Hatred cannot. And so the danger is when there's no avenue for anger to purgate itself, and it has to, and it turns into hatred. And in this dialogue, and in Anytus particular, one of the things that's really baffled me as I've been reading it, Anytus doesn't leave. He gets ticked off at Socrates. He says, look, you need to cut it out or there's going to be problems. And he sits there and he stays and he's a silent participant in the conversation, which is weird. There's a couple of different ways we can think about why. My personal favorite is, well, it's his house. He doesn't have to leave. But it seems like, at least here, it's anger. He doesn't become hatred until it festers and he feels the need to destroy Socrates. That's the way I've been thinking about that since Dr. Bartlett's talk. Charlie.
So I have a question. Do you believe, like, the claim that the virtuous don't teach their children out of fear? Wouldn't the virtuous individuals desire more virtuous people?
I mean, isn't it every parent's dream to have their child better off than they are? And Themistocles, Pericles are all deeply familiar with the danger that they faced because of their excellence in virtue. They were kicked out of the city and sentenced to death. I'm not a parent, but I would imagine that if at some point in my life I have kids, that's not going to be my highest hope and dream for them. So I do think that men of great virtue probably do look around and wish, I wish there were more people like me, but they probably don't want their children to suffer the same consequences for their greatness that they did. Maybe it's better to just have a nice child who's a member of polite society, has 1.5 cars and a white picket fence, than to be kicked out of the city. Yes?
So in the Republic, Socrates criticizes love of one's own. So, and like an attachment to one's own in a lot of ways. So would you say that there's still something honorable about that, even though he criticizes it? Because I mean, like, protecting your children, it seems like something, it might be honorable even if it means like giving up virtue.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Socrates hasn't fully corrupted me yet, because I do think there's something honorable to like the desire to take care of your kids and that filial love that's there. But I do think that that love of one's own is an impediment to cultivating more virtuous children, right? If I'm Themistocles and my greatest concern is virtue, not is Cleophantus going to have a comfortable life, then, and I've overcome that love of one's own to cultivate virtue, then I think that Socrates is at least consistent there in his desire to overcome the love of one's own. I mean, that's how I would think through his answer. It's hard for me to really say that's satisfying to Will Galloway, but it's what I think is there.
What if the city needs a virtuous man to survive? And as a follow-up to that, does Socrates see virtue as the person that could defend the city and allow it to survive? Like a Coriolanus that goes out and kills a bunch of people so that no one invades Rome? Or does he see virtue in something else, like philosophy?
I do think that virtuous men are necessary to survive, for the city to survive, right? The first example of a virtuous man that we get in this section of the text is Themistocles, who was a brilliant naval strategist and who prevented Athens from becoming a Persian colony. So I think that there's a reason that that's the first example that Socrates holds up. And, Pericles, of course, the great war hero. So I do think these people are necessary for the city to survive. But there's also a reason that Socrates, who's so deeply concerned with virtue, is participating in the philosophic life and not the political life.
So
Yes.
is there another dialogue you're into as well?
The next thing that I want to go back to read seriously again, I want to go back to the symposium. I'm not sure why, but I want to. So. Mary Catherine had a question, then I'll get you, Dr. Thompson.
Why do you think it's important to have this discussion in 2022, looking back?
My starting point is that old books can teach us something about our lives today. And that the concern for virtue in ancient Athens is just as important for my life, my interactions with you and with other people in this room and my friends outside of this room, as it was back then. And the concerns about human greatness, the concerns about whether or not virtue can be taught, what it's like to be virtuous within a regime that might not always be. I think those are still really pressing questions that might be part of the permanent human condition. Dr. Thompson.
Well, you are a son, and one day you may be a father.
Yes, sir.
So the question is, can virtue be taught? And I'm pretty sure your parents thought, yes, virtue can be taught. And I'm pretty sure just about every parent in the history of the whole world has thought virtue can be taught. And one day, you will be confronted with that same question. But it seems to me that actually the question of the dialogue is not the right question to be asked. Can virtue be taught? Of course virtue can be taught. Everybody does it every day.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The real question, the more interesting question is, how is virtue best taught?
Right.
It seems to me a more important question. And as your father suggested in his question, there are two parts to the question. There, on the one hand, there is the person who is doing the teaching, but on the other hand, there is the person who is being taught.
Right.
And the two have to go together.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is, as a son and a potential father, how is virtue best taught?
From my understanding of the dialogue, the best way that virtue is taught is by example and by imitation. I can't sit down with my future kid and be like, at all times and all places, you have to open the door. I should say that's a good rule, but I can't, it's not going to sink in that way. But if he sees me opening the door, then he's going to say, well, Dad does that, I'm going to open the door. So I think that examples matter a lot. I've been fortunate to have some really good ones. And I think that the proximity of those examples matters a lot. This kind of, what I'm about to say sort of conflicts with one of the main things in the dialogue, that good fathers don't always raise good sons. But I think that proximity does matter a lot. It's a lot easier to imitate somebody that you interact with and see on a daily basis than it is to imitate Themistocles. So I think the best way to teach virtue is to consciously participate in your own life and to offer that as a model for your kids. And there's going to be times you have to explain, like, this is why we do this. And there's going to be times where there just has to be the law of the land. It's like, we don't do that in this household. So those are also components of it. But the way that I answer your question is that it has to be an example and a proximate example.